make
Frenar.
I'll get off at your
Welcome to episode 1 of The Thinking Space. I'm glad you're here. This isn't really something to watch, so I invite you to put your phone down and just spend some time. I've been carrying a quote around with me these past few days. It's followed me. That sometimes happens, doesn't it? You hear someone say something or you read it, and for reasons you can't quite explain, it refuses to leave. The quote is from Charlie Chaplin. Life is a tragedy when seen in close-up, but a comedy in long shot. And I thought I knew exactly what it meant. But then I returned to it a few days later, and I realised I probably didn't. Because if we're honest, life doesn't always become a comedy. Some experiences we have remain heavy. Grief is always grief. Some people leave us, and the space they occupied in our lives can never quite be filled again. I don't think Chaplin was asking us to laugh at tragedy. I think he was inviting us to change where we stand. I realised recently how much of our lives we spend standing too close to things. Too close to tomorrow. To conversations that haven't happened yet. To things we wish we'd said or done differently. And to the problems that haven't even presented as problems yet. How exhausting. And the strangest thing is, we don't often notice it until much later. I was driving home one evening. Nothing unusual had happened. It had been, by all accounts, an ordinary day. The kind of day that just disappears into all others. I pulled into the driveway and turned the engine off. And for about 10 minutes stayed exactly where I was. And in that stillness, I noticed something I'd somehow been missing all day. The world hadn't been asking me to hurry and be busy. I'd been asking it of myself. Nobody else was applying the pressure or counting the minutes. That was all entirely homemade. And it made me feel uncomfortable, because it's easier to blame the world than it is to notice what we're doing to ourselves. And how often do we do that? How often do we mistake our own internal urgency for reality? How often have you said that in your life everything is chaos, when what you really mean is everything feels chaotic to me? I think the difference is important. I've always liked paintings. I don't know anything about art. In fact, if you asked me to explain why one painting belongs in a gallery and another doesn't, I'd be completely out of my depth. But if you imagine yourself standing in front of a painting, your nose just a few inches from the canvas, what would you see? You wouldn't see a painting. You would see a single brushstroke, a texture, a colour. It's only in stepping back that the picture begins to fully introduce itself. And this quote got me thinking. Our lives work the same way. Some days we experience aren't meant to make sense because we're standing inside them. Understanding requires distance, just enough to remember that today isn't the whole canvas. Is that a comforting thought? Maybe not. I'm not sure yet. Because if it's true, it also means there were moments I worried about far more than I needed to. Moments I allowed to define entire chapters of my story. Moments that, looking back now, barely occupy a corner of the painting. Maybe that's where Chaplin was pointing all along. I keep coming back to this idea that memory changes the size of things. Their place in the picture. There are moments I can remember with pure clarity. I remember sitting in the exam halls of my school, convinced my future depended on a single piece of paper. I remember relationships that felt as though they'd define the rest of my life. I remember being in jobs I never believed I'd leave. Worries that seemed so enormous I couldn't imagine ever thinking about anything else, and yet, here I am. And don't get me wrong, those moments mattered, of course. They shape us. They change our whole perception of experience. But they didn't become my whole life. Although at the time, it felt like they would. This is odd. Did somebody tell us about this when we were younger? Were we just too immature to hear it? When you're 19, 19 feels permanent, and when you're 30, you realise 19 was just a room you passed through, not an identity, just a room. I wonder how many rooms I've mistaken for the whole house. And maybe that's what growing older really gives us. Not more answers, just a longer corridor. More doors we've already walked through, enough to know that another one closes, but it's not the end of the building. I was speaking to someone recently, and they apologised for talking about something that happened years ago. They said, "I'm sorry. I should really be over this by now." Who decided that you should be over this by now? Who decided that grief gets 12 months, disappointment gets 6, and heartbreak only lasts until Christmas? Life doesn't respect schedules. It has its own rhythm. Sometimes it goes painfully slow, and sometimes it moves surprisingly fast. Most of the time, it is completely indifferent to our plans and expectations. Is that why we become so frustrated? Does delay translate into failure? I wonder what would happen if we looked upon our own lives with the same perspective as we look upon an old friend. Someone you love sitting across from you, telling you they've made a mistake, they've worried about tomorrow, they're convinced they've ruined everything. Would you lean forward and say, "Honestly, you should have sorted yourself out by now"? Of course you wouldn't. You'd listen. You'd remind them that one difficult season isn't the whole story. You'd remember who they are, even if they had temporarily forgotten. It's a curious thing, how naturally we offer perspective to others and withhold it from ourselves. Perhaps that's another consequence of standing too close. When you're inches from the canvas, you can't see the beauty, only the imperfections, only the brushstroke that looks out of place. Step back, and suddenly the very thing that seemed awkward gives the painting its depth. I wonder if the parts of ourselves we're most eager to erase might one day become the parts we understand most deeply. I don't know for sure. I'm still close enough to some of them that I can't really tell. And that's another thing that nobody mentions all that often. Just because time has passed doesn't mean you have new perspective. Sometimes new perspective is born out of someone else lending you theirs, a friend, a stranger, or a teacher. Someone who looks at your life from a place you simply can't occupy while you're living it. I've had conversations like that. Conversations where nothing was solved, there was no grand advice or miraculous breakthrough. I just walked away, breathing a little differently. As though someone had taken hold of the frame that surrounds the painting and tilted it slightly. The picture hadn't changed, but I had. That's why conversation matters. Because another person can sometimes see the edge of the canvas when all you can see is the paint. I like that thought. It takes the pressure off. It means we don't have to fix one another. We don't even have to agree with one another. It's simply enough to help somebody take one small step backwards towards a wider view. It's making me think about the space, about why I wanted to create the thinking space in the first place. I didn't want to create another platform or audience or even another project. I think, if I'm honest with you, I just wanted somewhere that you could arrive without having to pretend you're fine. A place where uncertainty isn't treated like a weakness, where silence didn't require an apology, where changing your mind wasn't a failure, more a sign that you're still aware and paying attention. Is that all that thinking is? Not collecting opinions, just allowing them to evolve. I rather hope I don't ever stop changing my mind. Because the day I become certain about everything is probably the day I stop noticing anything. And that, more than anything else, might be what Chaplin was trying to remind us of. Life doesn't necessarily become funny. Tragedy doesn't disappear. But we owe it to ourselves every now and then to take a step back, to breathe, to look again. Because the picture we are living is almost larger than the part that's hurting today. I wonder if we're actually very good at recognising the life we're living while we're living it. I don't think we are. I was looking through some old photographs a week ago. Not for any particular reason. I just opened the drawer and there they were. It's a strange experience looking at photographs of a version of yourself that you had no idea what was coming next. There I was, smiling into the camera, completely unaware of the conversations I'd have, the people I'd lose or meet, the mistakes I'd make or the things I'd survive. I thought to myself, if only I could tap that younger version of me on the shoulder. Not necessarily to warn him, I don't know if I'd want to do that. Just to tell him not to rush so much. To look up a little more often and notice where he already was instead of constantly wondering where he was meant to be. And I caught myself. That older version of me is saying exactly the same thing to the person I am tonight. And maybe 20 years from now, I'll look back on this recording and think, you were in such a hurry. You were worried about so many things that never came to pass, and you spent so much time trying to see around corners instead of looking through the window that was right in front of you. That makes me smile. And pause. Because if that's true, then maybe this moment deserves more of my attention than I've been giving it. And maybe that's true for you as well. We're forever trying to arrive somewhere. Even when there's nowhere obvious to arrive, we finish one task and immediately look for another. We reach Friday and we immediately begin thinking of Monday. We finally get that holiday we've been waiting for and spend the first 3 days wondering how quickly it's going to go. I've done that more times than I'd like to admit, and I bet you have too. It's as though part of us has always believed that life is waiting just over the next hill. And by the time we reach that hill, there's another hill. Maybe life was never meant to be conquered, just lived. And I sometimes think that we've become frightened of ordinary days. We call them just another day, as though ordinary has become unimportant. Yet if we reflect on the memories we treasure most, they're almost always ordinary. A cup of tea with someone who's no longer here. laughing so hard that our stomach hurts, driving with the window down and the music playing on a hot summer's day, walking in the rain. None of those moments arrive in a dramatic way. And none of them say as they do, pay attention, you'll miss this one day. They just happen. And then, as life goes on, they become more and more precious in our memory. Is that the tragedy of living in close-up? We're always looking for the extraordinary, while the ordinary is becoming the part we'll miss the most. There's something humble in that. It means the best parts of life aren't always hidden. Often they're overlooked. Maybe they just feel too familiar. And a familiar feeling has a habit of making miracles look ordinary. And soon we realise that it wasn't all just background noise. It was a symphony of life. Is that the motive behind this conversation? I don't think I have anything necessarily important to say. Quite the opposite. I had a feeling we've all been forgetting something important. This space is meant to stay curious. It's meant to leave room for changing our minds, for saying, I used to think this, but now I'm not so sure. Because that's what it means to be human. And we don't hear those words often enough anymore. So I'll leave Chaplin where I found him. As someone who asked us to take a step backwards. Enough to see that today's worry, however real, doesn't have to become your identity. Enough to remember that one difficult conversation, one painful season, one uncertain chapter cannot possibly tell the whole story of a life. Especially not when the book is still being written. In this conversation we've had, that's all the thinking space ever needs to be. We're not coming together to solve life. We're coming together to remember that it's larger than the part we're currently looking at. And I'm very glad that we've spent this time together. Thank you for listening. And until we find ourselves sharing this space again, take care. And every now and then, when life begins to feel impossibly close, see if you can take just one small step backwards. Not to escape the painting, just to see a little more of it. Goodbye.